Good afternoon, everyone, for those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to those of you elsewhere. Thanks for joining us for today's Division III webinar. We're going to do our best to tackle the topic of the NCAA Transgender Student Athlete Participation Policy. My name is Ann Rollman. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm the Director of Policy Education and Strategic Engagement in our NCAA Sports Science Institute. And I'm going to be joined later by Jean Merrill from our Office of Inclusion, and I'll let her introduce herself in full. A couple of things before we launch into the topic itself is just a reminder that you can access this PowerPoint on the Division III webinar page on ncaa.org. And that you will have full access to the recording, likely by the end of this week, but certainly in the next 7 to 10 days or so. So if you need either the PowerPoint or access to the recording, know that those will be available to you. Finally, from a housekeeping perspective, we're happy to take questions on this webinar. We're going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the bottom of the hour for that. So please feel free to add those to the Q&A function. Usually find that just at the top of the screen under Q&A. So type those in, send them in to us, and we'll do our best to answer questions. With that, a little opener on this topic. It's a difficult topic for a lot of reasons. It's been sensationalized in the media, in our current political environment. And so I just want to know a general thank you for those of you who are here today in hopes of learning information to support your student athletes. I'm going to assume everyone has good intent. And so don't be too worried about terminology. If you don't have it right, that's okay. We'll try to help out with that, but please ask your questions so we can get you any information you need about supporting your student athletes or making decisions at your campus or conference level. So with that, let's jump right into the topic. On the next screen, what we have here is that there's usually some confusion about the NCAA Transgender Student Athlete Participation Policy and what it actually governs. And what we have are the three things that we think most generally impact the experiences of our trans and non-binary and genderqueer student athletes. TSAP is just one piece of that. So it's the actual sort of eligibility policy. It's what student athletes have to meet in order to be eligible to compete for their Division III institutions. Other things in play are policies around championship facilities or policies that you might have at your campus level. Who can go where? What do they have access to? And so those are governed by a whole lot of things. The NCAA provides guidance on that, but there's local policy and even state laws that can impact how those things work. And then more broadly, there's guidance from the NCAA about the expectation for anti-discrimination at NCAA events. That might be something that Jean talks about briefly, but this overarching principle of the NCAA is that there is a lack of discrimination, that we're actively working to prevent discrimination at our NCAA events. So what I'm going to talk about is just one sliver of that. That's the eligibility process. And it's probably the piece that you don't always know it or are familiar with it until you need to know it. So we'll do our best to talk about it in a way that helps you should you be supporting one of your student athletes on campus. We'll go to the next slide. Here is a broad overview of the history of the Transgender Student Athlete Participation Policy. What's important for me that you take away from this slide is a lot of folks are just now for the first time, maybe in the last year or so, tuning into the NCAA having a Transgender Student Athlete Participation Policy. But as many of you know, there has actually been a policy in place since 2010. Importantly, very importantly, trans folks have existed and have been participating in NCAA sport since 2010 and likely way before that. Trans folks have been in sport since sport has been sport. So this isn't something that we're just now coming to or it is brand new. This is something that has been a part of our policy, our review structure, educating our committees and decision making for a very long time. You can see how that's progressed over the years, and the most recent change was the update in January of 2022. When the NCAA Board of Governors updated the policy based on the Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports recommendation. So I'll get more into that update, but we'll go to the next slide first. This slide, I think, is really important when you're trying to understand why is the policy what it is. The NCAA at the Board of Governors level has said it's not if we're trying to include trans athletes, but it's how. What are the requirements? And so when we're thinking about that, when we're trying to govern diverse views, values, expectations of an association of 1,100 schools, we have to think very broadly about balancing two of the NCAA's values. One is inclusion, non-discrimination, opportunity, collegiate values, the collegiate experience, supporting young people, et cetera. And then fairness. So, what are we thinking about when we think about fairness? Are we using evidence-based requirements? Are we recognizing that there's a diverse source of advantages that an individual might experience, right? Depending on my socioeconomic background, I might have access to coaching or not have access to coaching, and that can be a big impact on fairness. And we've actually found from the literature that those types of things can have as big of, if not bigger, impact on ability, athletic ability, than any of the biomedical impacts. The other thing that we're really working with and committed to is that we want to be informed by the IOC framework. What is the International Olympic Committee talking about? What's the guidance they're giving their national governing bodies? Do they have sport-specific knowledge that we can use to apply to our policy to help our student athletes? And so as those two things go back and forth, it's always trying to land in a place that does the least harm to our student athletes, but provides opportunity for participation. In the next slide, I like to give a brief review of what is normally included in these types of policies. What I want you to know is that the NCAA's policy looks like many of our other national governing body or sport governing body policies. And typically speaking, sport governing body policies are going to be made up of three things. The first is very typically they will have a testosterone threshold. So they'll say that a trans woman competing in women's sport might have to have a testosterone level that is below a certain threshold. A lot of times that's in the 5 range. You may have seen 2.5, you may have seen 10, and sometimes there is no threshold whatsoever. But typically speaking, they're going to address threshold. The second piece that's usually in a policy is a length of mitigation and expectation for maintenance. So that might mean that I have to be at a certain level for a certain amount of time before I would be eligible to compete as a trans woman in a women's sport. So for example, maybe I've met the threshold of 5, but I would have to be there for at least 12 months or 24 months or 36 months before I would be eligible to compete. The maintenance expectation is that once you're at that threshold, that you would maintain that threshold through the period of participation. And then thirdly, the other chunk in these policies are these additional considerations. Sometimes there's something like I have to declare that this is my gender and this is how I will be participating for the next so many years. In really extreme policies, they might require something like gender affirming surgery, or they might require that identification documents, the gender on those identification documents matches the gender in which you're participating. So a lot of things to consider. So 3 different areas, and we'll talk about how that applies to the NCAA policy. Perfect timing on the slide. So this is the update to the policy. The first step here is that all of our students have to continue to meet the 2010 policy. And as you've noted, and as very much a part of the public discourse, we focus and over-focus on trans women. Everything that I'm going to talk about today doesn't yet impact trans men, and the 2010 policy is what you should all be looking at when you're talking about trans men competing in men's sports. For trans women, the 2010 policy was that an individual would have to have undergone hormone suppression for at least 12 months or 1 calendar year. But with the update, we've added the second and then potentially additional requirements. The second requirement here is that they also have to meet sport-specific eligibility requirements that are going to be reviewed and approved by CSMAS. Very often, those are informed by the sport governing body policy. As part of this, they also have to submit documentation to the NCAA, usually roughly 3 times a year. We'll go into that in more detail. So the thing that we've added here, right, is a threshold or some kind of specific eligibility requirements that weren't in place before, and the requirement to submit documentation to the NCAA. Previously, this was all handled at the school level. The third consideration on the updated policy was because there was a lot of updates to this, that there would be a phased-in implementation, that we'd go in piece by piece to give proper notice and time for our student athletes to address what would be required of them. For the 23-24 academic year, what we're currently in, we're in phase 2. And that means that there are thresholds that are informed by the sport governing body policies. So we're meeting the 2010 policy, and student athletes have to meet specific thresholds. On the next slide, we'll talk about the submission. So there's largely 2 buckets for submission. So when you're on campus and thinking about this, when do I need to do this work? One is the part of the annual eligibility submission process, and one is specific to championship eligibility. So if you don't qualify for championships, then you don't have to worry about that second bucket. But the first bucket is one that you do have to worry about. And so we require submission of documentation prior to the traditional segment and then prior to the non-traditional segment, or the championship segment and the non-championship segment. So that means before, let's take a field hockey student athlete. Before a field hockey student athlete competes, you would need to submit the proper documentation to the NCAA and have that reviewed and approved. And then remember, that's any competition. So any outside competition, so competition that could be considered a scrimmage, that still has to be submitted to the NCAA beforehand. If it's intra-squad, if it's just your team, then that's okay. But if you're competing against an outside team, then we need that information before that competition occurs. Then, if you go through your year again in field hockey throughout the fall and you qualify for the NCAA championship, then you would need to submit again before that individual competes in the NCAA championship. Typically speaking, we say we need that information a week before the competition that they're going to compete in. That just ensures that we have enough time to align the review process and get a response back to you. Obviously, if something weird comes up and we need to try to rush it, we'll do our best. But if you get it to us a week before the competition, we can ensure that we'll get a decision back to you. After that, then you might have non-traditional competition, let's say in field hockey's case in the spring. And then if there's any competition there, we would need that submission again prior to the first non-traditional competition. So that's the timeline of it. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the review process. A lot of concern comes into play here regarding privacy and confidentiality. I want to be very specific here that we do everything we can to ensure that the privacy of the student athlete is protected. This is reviewed by our medical review panel of the CSMAS, Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports. That means they're all physicians and acutely aware of those types of healthcare related privacy laws. When that documentation is submitted to us, only one staff member on our staff sees it. They redact all the information, school, name of student athlete, et cetera, is removed. And then that panel of physicians takes a look at the documentation. The communication then goes back only to the individual identified by the school. And we recommend that the student athlete should have some say who that contact is. So if that contact is listed as the academic advisor, because that's the person the student athlete feels comfortable with, and your president calls us to say what's going on with this, we will politely say, what's going on with what? We don't know what you're talking about. We will only talk to the identified individual. So then we review, there's one review form, and then there's got to be evidence of lab results of that testosterone level. And those lab results must be within 4 weeks of the competition so that they're relevant and recent to the competition. So it's just a form that gets signed and then evidence of those lab results. And then as I noted before, at least 1 week prior to the initial competition so that we have enough time to review it. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. And then one more forward for me. And this is my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jean. We are in phase 2, and so the question is, what are we going to do in 24-25? Well, phase 3 of the policy says that we would consider all those other aspects of sport governing body policies. So all the things all those different sports require. So we could have a bunch of different types of policies for every sport. And I would guess even after today, you're going to go, this is really confusing. Well, it would only get way more confusing in phase 3, and there would have to be a lot more analysis if those pieces of those policies align with collegiate values. Are they something we would actually want in the NCAA? So there's administrative challenges because it would be really hard to implement and execute. Does it align with our values as an association? And then I haven't even talked at all about the complications regarding emerging info, policy trends, state legislation, Title IX. It's a really complicated, convoluted space at this time. And so for that reason, the CSMAS said, we really think we should probably stay in phase 2 until there's a little bit more clarity around this. And while we're doing that, we want to listen to the membership, and what they've been telling us is it needs to be simpler, it needs to be clear, and we need to have notice about what it's gonna be. So they think, CSMAS at least recommends that we stay in phase 2 for at least another year to let those issues settle. And they can work on maybe another solution, a better solution for any following year. This is still a Board of Governors policy, and the Board of Governors has to make decisions about that. And we expect to hear more from them after their April meeting. So that's what's next, so to speak. And phase 3 may or may not happen, but probably not in the way it was originally planned. That's a heck of a way to leave it, Jean, but that's in short how the policy works. Let me turn it over to you to talk about how you implement and provide good spaces on campus.
All right, thanks so much, Anne, and good afternoon or good morning, friends in Division 3. It's good to be with you. Before I start my spiel, I would just invite you all, as a reminder, to submit any questions through the Q&A function. So Anne will answer questions specific to the trans student athlete participation policy, and then I'll certainly answer any questions that are more around creating inclusive spaces for our trans plus student athletes. So again, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jean Merrill. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm Director of Inclusion here at the National Office, and one of my proud responsibilities is leading in our area of LGBTQ inclusion. And I just want to take a moment to thank Division 3 under the leadership of Louise McCleary for leading our association as a division in LGBTQ inclusion practices. So just a tip of the cap and bend of the knee to Division 3 on that great work. So let's go ahead to the next slide. I want to talk about trans inclusive practices, but first we want to talk about why trans inclusion in sport is important. And first of all, I really want to embolden and underscore that trans plus athletes are humans. They are deserving of our dignity and respect, just as every human being is deserving of dignity and respect. And so trans folks are of no exception to that. Our trans plus student athletes love their sports. They have dedicated their lives to their sports. They want to succeed and excel based on their own merit and their own work ethic, and not by way of cheating. Sports are a human right, and everyone should have access. In fact, participation in sport is actually recognized by the United Nations, UNESCO, and the Olympic Charter because sport contributes to a life of happiness and health. So sport is truly a human right. Trans athletes want to live authentically and feel affirmed. Like I said, trans athletes are not trying to dupe the system. They are trying to live their authentic selves. And part of that is being able to participate in a sport in accordance with their gender identity. Another reason trans inclusion is important is our trans student athletes face many risks, ranging from gender dysphoria to poor mental health, to verbal, physical, and sexual violence, and certainly suicide is no exception, and suicidal ideation. And then lastly, it's interesting, according to the CDC in 2020, in 2020 publications have stated that trans-inclusive sports policies actually demonstrate consistent or increased participation of girls in sports. So that's something that we don't hear a lot about, and wanted to make that known to you all. Next slide, please. Another reason why trans inclusion in sport is so important is looking at our map of the United States. We have hundreds of anti-trans legislation bills and passed laws at the state level. As you see here in the dark blue, we have 24 states that have passed anti-trans legislation at the K through 12 level that impacts trans student athletes to participate. And then in addition to that, we have 20 states that have passed similar legislation for intercollegiate athletics. So we have 20 states across our country that prohibit trans student athletes at our Division I, Division II, and Division III institutions from participating in sport. We do have one state, California, that has actively passed trans permissive legislation at the K through 12 level. So that's something that we also wanted to make folks aware of. Next slide, please. So continuing on why trans inclusion in sport is important, trans athletes are twice as likely as their cisgender peers to face debilitating depression, overwhelming anxiety, and to have considered self-harm or suicide. That data and those trends continue to bear out in our most recent NCAA mental health study that was published in December of 23. According to the Association of American Universities, 23% of transgender, genderqueer, and nonconforming college students have reported non-consensual contact. 86% of our trans and non-binary youth have said that debates about state laws restricting the rights of trans people have negatively impacted their mental health, and 55% of those trans and non-binary youth have said it has impacted them very negatively, according to the Trevor Project, which is an organization that seeks to reduce and eliminate suicide and suicidal ideation amongst LGBTQ youth. According to the same study, 48% of those LGBTQ youth reported that it gives them stress or anxiety very often, these discussions about state law restrictions. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the why of inclusion. Inclusion of high school trans athletes has had no negative impact on sport participation or athletic achievements for cis women and girls. Participation of women and girls continues to grow in states with trans inclusive policies for high school sports, such as California and Connecticut. And interestingly, cisgender heterosexual teammates at intercollegiate club and varsity levels are increasingly accepting of trans participation and supportive of LGBTQ non-discrimination policies. So if we can go ahead to the next slide. I know we're up against time, and I really want to allow a few moments for questions. The rest of this presentation is really on what you as coaches and administrators can do on your campuses to create inclusive spaces for your trans plus student athletes. First and foremost is education and awareness. Learn and use trans inclusive language. Educate yourselves about trans identities, their experiences, both their challenges and their joys. Stay current on what guidelines and policies related to trans inclusion in sport mean on your campus. So understand your state law, understand local jurisdiction, keep tracking on what Title IX proposed regulations are indicating. Foster an awareness amongst your peer administrators, your coaches, your student athletes, your fan base and donors, as well as other stakeholders about the importance and benefits of trans plus inclusion. And start that before you have a trans individual on campus. Many of you have trans folks on campus and trans student athletes in particular, but if you don't, go ahead and do proactive efforts to create these inclusive spaces and build out that culture. Next slide, please. So inclusive policies certainly is going to be an important part of that. So making sure that you're reviewing, you're revising your campus inclusive policies, your conference inclusive policies, but in congruence with our NCAA trans student athlete policy, as well as any relevant state legislation. The last thing we want you to do, particularly if there's state legislation that runs up against trans inclusive campus policies, is we do not want you to break the law. That does not benefit anyone, literally anyone, by breaking the law. Collaborate with your athletics associations, whether that's the NCAA or your individual conferences, other governing bodies. We're all in this together and can really learn from one another's policies. Confidentiality and privacy. Please respect and uphold the confidentiality and privacy of your student athletes. Not only is it kind of a moral obligation, but certainly FERPA and HIPAA are going to oblige you to that as well. Avoid disclosing or outing trans identities without a student athlete's explicit consent. And also provide safe private spaces for your student athletes, whether they're trans or cisgender, to discuss their needs, their concerns, and their accommodations they may require. Next slide, please. Again, supportive environment. A lot of that's going to happen even before you have a trans student athlete on campus. So really taking time to engage in conversation that is respectful and acknowledging people are coming from different places, but building that culture out before you have a trans student athlete on your campus. It's always good to build that culture and welcome trans individuals into your spaces rather than trying to triage and kind of duct tape practices, inclusive practices, once you have a trans student athlete on campus. So taking those proactive measures is really critical. One thing I want to underscore, take an individualized approach to this. Most of my conversations around trans student athlete participation are with individual schools or individual conferences about individual trans student athletes, because every trans student athlete's experience is unique, every campus is unique. So it's really critical that you're not just trying to fit this into a frame or a template, that you're really taking an individualized approach to this and making sure that your trans student athlete is part of that approach, that they're part of the plan, the support plan, and really leading the charge in how they want to be supported, who they want to know, how much they want to engage in that process. Next slide, please. Professional development is going to be a really important thing. So one thing I would say is, if you have not, I encourage you to invite external organizations or experts to your campus to engage in conversations around trans inclusion. Certainly want to plug Chris Mosier of transathlete.com as well as Athlete Ally as tremendous resources. So you can reach out to them, see if they're interested or available, but certainly they can also put you in touch with other incredible organizations that can provide that service on campus. Visibility is going to be a good thing. I know a lot of you all do LGBTQ Pride Nights. You may want to continue that and kind of build in trans-specific visibility into your Pride Nights. You can also do a standalone trans Pride Night, but really highlighting the joys and the presence of trans student athletes in our NCAA membership is really important. And I think part of that raising of visibility is also breaking down stereotypes and misconceptions that have run rampant, particularly in the last few years. So I'll pause there. I think we are getting close to time. If you can go to the next slide, Katie. Again, I want to just do a real sincere call out and appreciation to Division III. They have developed some incredible LGBTQ resources through their One Team, through their working group and their One Team initiative. And so I certainly point you towards those resources as well. Please reach out to me if you, as an institution, as an administrator, a coach, a conference administrator, if you want to talk about specific ways to support your student athletes, I'm more than happy to do so. And I know we have a couple of questions. I will apologize for just being so quick on this presentation.
Yeah, Jean, it's hard. It's a lot to talk about. There's one quick one for you that I think you can answer, but someone asked for some help in creating a policy. Is there some kind of template to work from, or is the Office of Inclusion a resource that they could use in developing a policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, it's going to be an individualized approach. So you have our email addresses here. Please reach out to me individually. I'll also give my personal email, jlmerrill@nca.org, because a lot of it is going to be dependent on your state law, on what your campus policy is, what your conference policy is. So there are a few mechanics to that, but I would certainly welcome that conversation. Again, it's going to be policy for what? Is it policy for participation, or is it policy for access to facilities, or for record keeping there? So when we're talking about policy, we need to tease that out a little bit. So please reach out to me, and I'm happy to engage in that conversation.
And one last question before I think we got to sign off here at the hour, is there's a question about, is it appropriate to assume that the way that the transgender student athlete participation policy sort of gets triggered is that an athlete has to say, I'm trans and I need your help in meeting the policy school? And the answer to that is yes. That actually works like almost every other eligibility process, where it might be for a bunch of other reasons. You tell someone what the rules are, and then they have to declare whether or not they have something that would implicate those rules. And so that is how the policy is intended to work. The committee has talked about these issues of someone might accuse somebody of being trans and that they might have to prove their gender. And the committee has already said that its drug testing program and the transgender student athlete participation policy is not intended for and shall not be used in that manner, that certainly would do more harm than good. So if an individual doesn't say that they're trans, then your assumption is that there's no work for you to do. Now, that being said, this is where Jean and issues of inclusion and making sure people feel comfortable in talking to you or someone on your campus so that they can get the proper assistance and meeting that policy comes into play. And that can be far more difficult than just simply getting the documentation you need. So complicated question, but yes, we are relying on individuals like we do in almost all of the eligibility spaces. All right, Jean, I think that's all the time we have today. Again, big thanks to D3, Louise McCleary, et cetera. And feel free to reach out to either of us should you have questions on the policy itself or issues of inclusion.